Alright, so welcome to the first video here on how to use Unity for absolute beginners. So we're going to start today with some Unity basics, working in the editor, moving around, the hierarchy, the inspector, kind of the basic concepts of how the Unity engine works, specifically the editor and the user interface. And after that, we'll get into some coding, very basic. Like I said, this is going to be the beginning of a series that's targeted at absolute beginners. So if you're new to Unity, you'll definitely benefit from this. If you're new to C# coding or coding in general, this tutorial is for you. If you are coming from another language, you might still find some use out of it. But let's get going. So right now I have an open project that I've already created. We're going to go into how you would go about starting a new project just for the heck of it here. I am using Unity Hub. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it's basically like a kind of a launcher for Unity that they introduced not too long ago. So this is a way to kind of access your projects like you always used to, and then also it has direct access to Unity Learn, and you can manage your particular install versions of Unity here. So if you're just starting it for the first time, you should be updated to the newest version, which is right here. If you are not, then it's pretty simple. You just go over to Unity Hub, and download it from there. So just download Unity Hub. I've already downloaded it, but go ahead and do that. Just come back down here, open the executable or the setup file, run that, let it download, and I'm guessing that it most likely will download the newest version of Unity to begin with automatically. I would assume so. So once you get that done, go ahead and open the Unity Hub, go into New. See, this menu right here allows you to select the version, but it should default to the newest version, or if you're downloading for the first time, the only version you have. So we'll go ahead and click New. We're going to start with a 3D project. Obviously give it a name, whatever you want to name it. Something to notice here, take note of the location that it's in. Mine automatically goes to my GitHub folder, my repos there, so I can upload those later. And then after you're done with that, just go ahead and hit create. So now here we are, and I have a slight little bit of a demo setup that I kind of made. All I have here is a Unity terrain, which is basically a plane and a player and an enemy character here. So just to go over the windows, so scene view is your first tab. You have scene and you have game. So scene is the actual developer interface, I guess you'd call it, for you to see what's going on and arrange your game objects, stuff like that. And the game is actually what will be rendered from the point of view of the player. So if you can see here, zoom in, I have my camera, my main camera. It's a child of the player, and it gives me a little camera preview, and that is what you will actually see in the game. So not much difference based on what you'll see, other than that this is obviously the camera view. Alright, now movement in the interface can be kind of a pain when you first start. The absolute easiest way to move for me is if I hold right click. You'll see my mouse icon will turn to this little eye. I can go right, left, I can look around in kind of a rotational way here. And the best way I've found to move, and I use it the most often, is just by holding right click and using the WASD keys, just as if it were a game. You're going to see the annoying key tracker that I have here in the left because I'm holding down the keys, but just do your WASD. You can move around. That is always the simplest way for me. You can just zoom with the mouse wheel. You can also pan by pushing the mouse wheel in, left, right, like so. and that is the basics. And if you notice, the viewing types or viewing modes, if you will, that are changing based on what I'm doing are actually up here. So you can manually click move, then I can left click and drag and move around. I can go into, is this another move tool? Not sure what that one is. I think that one's just a look around. Rotate, scale, rect. A lot of these are based on the actual game objects themselves. So if I go here and click, you can see I'm in rotate mode, and it's showing all the rotational axes here. And I can of course just drag one and spin it like that because I'm in the rotate mode. Now, so as far as user movement, that's pretty much the basics. We get into game or game object movement here. This is one of them. So we have the rotational ability right here. You can use this to switch into the different modes. Okay, so here's your move tool, which just gives you your X, Y, and Z. Pretty simple. You can also, other than grabbing these, you can actually grab the axes panes, I guess you would call them, and that will, if I grab this one, I can move it along the, I guess what you call that, the X and the Z. I can move it along this pane, and it's not going to change elevation at all. So it's going to kind of lock it to the X and the Z. And the same thing for this. I can get on that Y and it will keep level with the Z, it looks like, and vice versa. Control Z a bunch of times, put that back where it was. So there is that. Yeah, so moving game objects, the shortcut that I use as opposed to having to come up here and change move types is W, E, R, T. I think those are the main ones I use. So to go over it again, W, looks like that switches to our axes move. E will switch us into rotation. R will switch us into scaling. I can scale on my Y, Z, X, etc. Or I can scale universally, globally. And then T takes us into rect. I mean, that is going to scale as if it's a UI element. I don't see any reason to use that on a 3D object. That is mainly for your UI. Alright, so that is the basic movement. Like I said, remember to hold right mouse button and do your WASD. That is, for me, always the most intuitive way to move. It's just like a video game movement. So there's that. Now the other thing, we have our hierarchy. This is basically just a list of what we have in our scene at the moment. So we have our terrain, the player, enemy, the child objects, the main camera, player weapon, etc. So we have all that. Yeah, there's not much going on in the scene right now, so there's not a whole lot in there. Second most important thing probably is our project view. Now this is basically just the folder structure that we have. So think of it like a file explorer. There's not much here because this is a brand new scene. So in my root folder, basically my assets folder, I have literally everything that I've created in here. My textures for the terrain, animation controller, animator, etc. Some scripts. This is obviously terrible folder structure. I'm kind of anal about file organization, so don't get too mad at me about that, but there's only a few of them, so not a big deal. Basically, it's the file explorer. And then also, this is, let's see, yep, so this is basically, boom, if you open that, it's exactly mirrored to what you're going to see in your own file explorer. So if I were to rename the scenes folder in here, it will change and show up in here. So it's just a perfect mirror image. If I were to drag a file into this Explorer mode, then it would obviously kind of reload once I went back to Unity and pop up in there. So there's that. We have our console. This is obviously where our errors will be logged. This is our output. If I debug log hello world, it's going to show up here. If a script throws an error, it's also going to show up here. So this is where you want to look if something goes crazy. You can do your debugging in here, etc., etc. Animation window, we're not going to go over that. We're just going to go over the basic default kind of most important windows here. And last but definitely not least, the inspector. So this is just like it says, the inspector. It's basically the properties of whatever you're currently looking at. So if I switch to this guy, I'm going to get everything about him. If I switch to the enemy, same thing. Terrain, I have different things. So yeah, now what you're going to see in the inspector, now Unity is a component based engine. So from like an architectural point of view, I started out as a Unity beginner. I started with Unity when I could barely code at all. So I didn't know any better when I was using it, but if you're coming from a coding background or some certain different discipline where you've used a particular architecture or framework, just recognize that Unity is basically a component type system. So it's already set up that way. I know there's, that can be considered a design architecture, sort of setup in other softwares. I never knew that. This was all I ever knew. But from the start, think of it like that. Everything is separated into certain components. You can take only what you need and only use what you need, which is really nice. So looking in the inspector, these are the components that we have, and I can expand these, and there they are. But what really confused me when I first started working with Unity is I got really flustered by looking at all these things and all this data and not knowing what the heck any of it meant. So just to go ahead and close these so you get the idea, this is simply a game object named player, and it is composed of certain components. So you just think of a component, or a game object in Unity as the sum of its parts. A player is only a group of components which consists of a transform, cube, mesh filter, a mesh renderer, a box collider, and the character script, and then also his default material. So just to go over some of these, because they definitely confused me in the beginning. These are components. You can think of them, like I said, as properties of the object. So player game object has a transform, it has a cube mesh filter, and what we can do through our scripting, basically scripting, all it is in this game engine, is writing scripts that modify the different components attached to our game object. So if I write a script that says, move player object on its, Y position 1 unit per frame, I mean, that would be obviously extremely fast, first of all, but all the script is going to do is 1 per frame. It's going to go 1, 1, 1, 1. So all the script is basically an automatic way of editing the properties that we have, and changing them in real time. Now that probably seems very obvious if you have a background in coding, but like I said, I was an absolute beginner when I started using Unity. I couldn't code anything at all. So looking at it like that made a lot of sense to me, just to think of the scripts as in real time, automatically adjusting the values that we can always adjust ourselves most of the time in here in the inspector, but the code is doing it in real time automatically, or based on certain inputs or things and stuff like that. So okay, so we have the transform. Now the transform is simply these three things, and this is pretty simple when you break it down like this. It has a position. It has a position in world space on the X, Y, and Z. That's all it is, and that, I'm guessing, should be pretty intuitive. It's basically, I remember in middle school having the Cartesian, I think it's called, coordinate system. You have to plot a point on the X, Y. There usually wasn't a Z because it was in 2D, but that's the idea. This has a position in global space, 2.13, 3.28, and right here. So that's pretty simple. It has a rotation, and that is its transform. So the transform component contains three other components, and you have to think in this hierarchy type nested sort of thing. That if I'm trying to access the transform or the position on the X, I have to say something in code like GameObject.transform.position.x to have to kind of dig into the data and get to that X. Like I said, some of this might be obvious to people who have some coding experience, but for me it was not. I remember that. So there's that, the cube mesh filter. I'm just going to quickly go through some of these because not all of the explanations I'm giving will make a whole lot of sense until we get into some actual coding. So the mesh filter. Now the mesh filter describes the shape that the object has. So if I turn it off, it has no shape. Pretty simple. It's the geometrical shape that the object has. The mesh renderer is what renders the mesh. So that's pretty simple. If you turn it off, it's not going to be there. Now the box collider is basically a collision system or a parameter that can detect collisions. Pretty simple. So you throw a rock at this box in the game, the rock is going to pass through the collider and it's going to detect that there is a collision. So that's a lot of times we can write in code on trigger enter, on collision, stuff like that, detect if something went in, figure out what it was, and then go from there. So there's that. There's a script that I attached to this guy, and that's just a basic script that I've written for him. It has a weapon animator on him, but we'll get into that later. And it has a material. The material describes what it looks like using a shader, and that's pretty straightforward as well. So that is the absolute basic intro to the interface and kind of conceptually how it works. Not very exciting, but important to get through the basics. So we're done with that, and I guess in my final note I'll say coding is naturally a hard thing to do. I think anyone who tells you it's not is either jaded, has forgot their days of learning how to code, or just kind of thinks that they're better than everyone else. But the reality is I consider myself a pretty smart guy, and it's taken me a few years to get halfway comfortable, and I would still consider myself an intermediate beginner. So coding is a naturally unintuitive thing. It's hard to learn, but if you keep at it and you don't quit and you don't give up, you can eventually get there.